Well, good afternoon again. Chief, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So a couple of things just...
Let's stop for a second.
Oh, here we go.
Okay, you got that.
Here we go.
Everybody needs to know this. Troy and I have some history together, and I'm actually from Washington, D.C., and I attended the University of Maryland. So Troy called me and said, hey, you know what? The Big Ten Conference is here, and Maryland's playing Indiana. So I thought I was coming to the Big Ten Conference. It's a good thing I wore a suit, though. But anyway, I'm here.
Well, you're in the panel. I will be going to the Big Ten Conference, so I appreciate that. A couple of things. I'll just let you know that obviously we know each other. We've known each other for a while. But back in December of 2002, I was a lieutenant assigned to Jefferson County Police Department, which was the department that took in the county area outside of the city of Louisville. And merger referendum had occurred. It had passed. I was a police officer. I'd worked in the judge's office, worked on that referendum, moved back to the police department, and then all of a sudden the new mayor announced that he was going to hire a new police chief by the name of R.C. White. And Chief White came to Louisville, the largest merger of two municipal police departments of its kind in the nation at that time. I was blessed that I was selected to interview for the chief of staff position as Chief White's chief of staff for 6 years. And they weren't long years. They were good, solid, hardworking, learned a great deal, and I can honestly say my greatest mentor in policing, and the reason I'm here in Indianapolis. So if there's some people here not happy I'm in Indianapolis, you can blame Chief White. So with that said, Chief, we just heard a great presentation from Dr. Carter, and the mayor was here and wanted to hear that as well. Every mayor, every police chief is concerned about this, and I guess the question I have for you is, what do we do to stop these type of incidents from occurring in our cities that occurred in Ferguson, or even what's going on in Baltimore?
Well, you know, first, I don't think there's any absolute guarantee that you're never going to have that incident, but I think there's a lot of things that we can do to greatly mitigate those. Yeah, first and foremost, from my perspective, after doing this for somewhat 40 years in 5 police departments, I've come to the conclusion that policing has changed, but the police haven't changed. And part of our task as managers, administrators, supervisors, is to have police officers get in sync and meet the expectations of the community. And in order for that to happen, there's a few things that I think we really have to do that are very significant. Now, as I had mentioned, Troy and I worked together in Louisville, and I've worked in 4 other police departments. And I will tell you, starting in Washington, D.C., and all of those departments do a phenomenal job in training officers on the policies, the laws, procedures, and the tactical stuff, and all that other stuff. A great job. But in all of those departments, and then I think part of my reason for being hired in Denver, which is a department very similar to Indianapolis in size, by the way, is that there were a lot of controversial things happening in the community. There were a lot of shootings, predominantly by white males, white male officers to individuals of color. And a lot of citizens were asking the question, how come the officer didn't get fired? How come the officer didn't go to jail? How come that officer's still on the street? The officer broke the law. And I will tell you, most of the time, not all of the time, the officers did not break the law. Some of the times they broke the law, but most of the times they didn't break the law. What citizens were actually asking themselves, and what I was asking myself several times is, while those actions were legal, the question is, were they necessary? So I will tell you that I believe after 40 years, 5 departments are doing this, the biggest disconnect, one of the biggest disconnects we have in law enforcement with parts of the community that are really questioning what we do is not that we don't train our officers well. They're asking, why do we make the decisions that we make? So from my perspective, looking at the department I'm at now, and we're not an exception to that, I will tell, and this is not a popular thing, and I'll probably get in trouble for it, but I get in trouble anyway. The only test post is the state certified process where all certified officers have to go to. The only test that you have to get 100 for in the state of Colorado to be certified is firearms. And think about that. So we're in an environment where we're talking about changing the culture, we're talking about de-escalation, we're talking about sanctity of life. And the only test that you have to get 100 for to be certified, and I'm on the post board, by the way, and I've made an issue out of this, and not to the surprise of Troy or my good friend Dennis Sims, they're not surprised that the other members on the post board were looking at me sideways for bringing this issue up. We're talking about changing how we police, but we're not changing what we value. So I think the first thing that we really have to do, we have to look at our department and look at what we value. Now, every department I have worked for and worked in, including Louisville, is when an officer gets involved in a shooting incident, for an example, and it's a justified shooting incident. And then we have an award ceremony, and we give the officer an award. Okay. An officer gets involved, and I was one of those officers in D.C., not shooting. Makes a lot of arrests. I made a lot of arrests as a police officer. I was a very aggressive police officer. We have an award ceremony, and guess who gets the award? The officer that made the most arrests. So I am of the opinion, and what we're attempting to do in the department that I'm working with now is, you know, sometimes things happen and officers will get involved in shooting. But I'd much rather reward the officer that could have gotten involved in the shooting, but he didn't do it because he or she was able to de-escalate that. I much prefer to award the officer who didn't make the 1,000 arrests, but worked with his partner, worked with his supervisors, and prevented those crimes from even occurring. So that's the culture change, and I'm sure later on, I think we're going to talk about the 30 points that PERF has recommended. But before you can even make those kind of changes, I think what you have to do is look at what you value as a police department. Look at what the expectations of that community, and making sure that what you're valuing are meeting the standards of that community. And if you do that, and if you're transparent, and if you have a community or if you have a police department that understands, regardless of anyone's station in life, regardless of where they're from, what they believe in, if you treat them with dignity and respect, and Dr. Carter talked about that, but the other thing that you also have to do is you have to make sure that they have a voice in the issues that are relevant to them as it relates to their safety. So it's not, you know, a long time ago, we look at these maps and we look at what crimes are occurring and we say these are the strategies that we're going to use. And we go out and we do that. That is not good enough anymore. Not only do you need to do that, you need to bring that community in and have a seat at the table and not only express it in what you're seeing from a professional perspective, technology, whatever you use to identify crime, but you also need to give them a voice at that table as it relates to, you need to listen to them and find out what they value. What are the things that are important to them as it relates to their safety? So I think if we establish those relationships, Troy, which is something you talked about in your introduction, and establishing a relationship has to be ongoing, and it has to be a partnership, because again, while policing has evolved, there's certain things that haven't changed, and Dr. Carter was 100% correct in saying this. The police is the community, and the community is the police. The two has to become one. Now, I have said this, and I've gotten in trouble before, again, which is not surprising. I would take that thin blue line and I would erase it, because I think it has gotten interpreted to mean the wrong thing. It's got to mean the good guys against the bad guys, and some people have determined it to be the police against everybody. So the two absolutely have to become one. And in order for the two to become one, that means that both of them have a responsibility to partner with each other.
So a couple of things I've always heard you say is, because it's legal doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And then we're talking to you, an arrest doesn't necessarily mean that you're a successful officer. So we have my entire command staff's here today from IMPD. We have federal partners, Jay Abbott from the FBI. We have our local partners. We have those smaller departments and sheriff agencies around Indianapolis that are so vital to our success. All of us struggle with the same thing, is how do we train our officers appropriately to understand this? And then evaluations. Most cities that I've been involved in, you have so many more years of history, the evaluation process. How do we change the evaluation process to make sure that it reflects what we want our department to look like?
That's, none of this is, actually, if I ever write a book, which I probably won't, it would probably be entitled, "Are you sure you want to be a police chief?" Because it is not a popularity contest. So you gotta, and I spent a year of my life trying to be really popular when I was a young lieutenant in D.C. I said, I'm going to make everybody like and love me that works for me. I took more Maylocks that year than I've ever taken my entire life. So I think what you have to realize, first of all, is what do you value, and what do you value? And I would tell you that we changed our entire evaluation system in Denver, to the chagrin of a lot of members, a lot of the executive board on the union, on on the union as relates to that. But it goes back to what I said earlier. I mean, if you're telling me that the only thing you got to get 100 on is your shooting, but then we're in an environment where the community is really expecting you to de-escalate these scenarios, and they really want to have a voice. That means that and if you're telling me that you're giving out awards for officers who make the most arrests and officers who have these justified shootings, that to some degree conflicts with where we are today in policing. And that's what I said earlier, why I think policing has changed, but the police officers and police departments haven't changed. It's that tough decision and that tough love that you just have to look at exactly how do we get where we need to be, where we're meeting those communities' expectations. And that means changing the evaluation system. My evaluation system speaks to how many positive contacts have you made. Not necessarily how many arrests have you made, as it relates to the geographic area that you're working in. What are the issues that are driving the crime there? What kind of relationships do you have? Do you know who's organized? Do you know who's not organized? What kind of relationships do you have with the advisory groups? Do you know where the little thugs live? Do you know who they associate with? So it's having a complete profile, something that you and I talked about going back to our Louisville days, of everything that occurs in your area of responsibility and having a relationship with everybody in that area and responsibility. And the other thing that I think we really have to make that is extremely important and that is controversial is this whole thing that's called sanctity of life. In the past, and we still do it to today, and I want all these officers to understand, so before you go back and call the union in Denver, I want to make sure you understand what I'm about to say here. There is not a day that goes by where we don't want officers to go home to their families at the end of the day. That will never change. But this is what we also have to consider. The individuals that are creating havoc in your community, the individuals that are creating a situation where it might be potentially deadly, guess what? You want that individual to go home at the end of the day. Or you want that individual to go to jail at the end of the day. Or to go in the court system at the end of the day. So I think in addition to us looking after each other as police officers, we need to understand that we also have a responsibility for dealing with those individuals in the community, whether they're good or bad. And they have the same right to be able to go at the end of the day, to be able to go wherever they need to go without losing their life. So those are the changes that you have to make in your police department. And I will tell you that some of them are very tough and some of them are very, very, very controversial.
So let's talk about one of those controversial things from our past. So you'd been chief in Louisville, Kentucky for, I'm guessing it was less than a year. And there was an awards banquet that was being held, and the committee voted to give someone an award who had been involved in a police action shooting. The individual that was involved in that shooting returned fire on the suspect, I think, if I remember this correctly. And you made the decision as the chief not to give an award in that case. Can you explain that reasoning and what message you were sending internally and also externally to the community?
Yeah, and it goes back to Ken, I'm repeating myself. What the history had been, as I had suggested, Troy alluded to, that in the past, if you were involved in those kind of situations, and at the award ceremony, you got an award. It was evident to me, even prior to coming to Louisville, that we needed to change how we acknowledge officers and change what the value system is. So simply what my thinking was, if you save someone else's life, and that means you have to use force to do that, and you save someone else's life, that is certainly worthy of being acknowledged in an award ceremony. But if you're in a one-on-one confrontation and it's you against the bad guy, and you have to take that person's life, to me, that is not something that we should be giving at an award ceremony. I mean, from my perspective, you should go home at the end of the day and thank Jesus that you made it home okay, and that's the award that you get as relates to that. And I think that was important to send that message out to the community, because what had happened in the past, not just in Louisville, but in most of the places I worked in, most of the departments, that there is parts of the community saying, you kill somebody and now you're giving that person an award for killing somebody in a one-on-one situation. That was an ethical issue in many communities across this country, but I also got to tell you as it relates to Louisville. this is an aside. When I first went to Louisville, as Troy had mentioned, it was the county police and the city police. And there was a lot of contention between county guys like Dennis Sims who sit in the front row. They didn't want to work in the city. City guys, I think we got one of our majors here, he didn't want to work in the county. He didn't want to work with those county guys because they didn't know anything about policing. So there was this divide between these two agencies. So I get there, and when you're new and you go to a job, the community will tell you, congratulations, we wish you well. And I should have known something was going to be different about my Louisville experience, because they say, congratulations, we wish you well, and we're praying for you. So I should have known that there were a lot of challenges ahead.
There was a few. I see a couple people looking at Dennis Sims here, but Dennis is going to be on the panel, so he'll get even in a moment, I'm assuming. Yeah, he's taking notes. So, Chief Lake, and here's another thing that this is some of a concern of mine. I'm a big believer in police accountability. You're a big believer in police accountability. Reforming police departments. You are known as a change agent. I was your chief of staff for 6 years. We got phone calls from California, New York, Chicago. It seemed like Chicago was calling every other week, trying to get you to come to their departments because there were so many issues. And they knew they needed a change agent, and you were that change agent. And I think what was missed in all those conversations was what you did with the community. And I'd like for you to explain what's the community's role. I think sometimes that gets overlooked. When people were looking for police chiefs, they were looking at you because you weren't afraid to make those tough decisions. But what they overlooked a lot of times is how you work with the community and how you challenge the community.
Well, I believe you have 1,600 police officers in this department, and I will tell you, I suspect that their enforcement actions are outstanding, like most major police departments. But that being said, a crime occurs. I will tell you that the chances are probably only about 10% that an officer is going to get on the scene in time, observe the crime, and make the arrest. 10% of the time, they actually get there and they actually catch the guy in the act of doing that. That's sort of like a R.C. White national average of when that occurs. The greatest resource any community has, the police department has, in the case of Indianapolis, I believe it's 800,000 residents that live here. So if you're really going to be effective in having any long-term impact on preventing crime, and that's what you all pay us to do, to prevent crime from occurring, the greatest tool that you have are the citizens that live and work in the community. And the reality of it is, citizens are more willing to work with you if they know you, if you treat them with dignity and respect, and if they have a voice. So while I understand the significant role that police officers have, and as a chief, that the significant role that we have as it relates to the troops, the men and women that we're counting on doing that job. But they are a tool to really address what our real responsibility is, and that's connecting with that community. And I will tell you, I am of the belief that if you're not connecting with many parts of the community, you're not going to be successful in having any long-term impact in addressing crime. Now, you can tell me that you have a burglary problem at 500 block of Southwest Street. That's kind of where I'm staying right now. That's the only reason I'm over there saying. And Troy can send his team out there with the commander, and as long as they're out there, they can put their arms around that burglary problem. But eventually, because of all the challenges they're going to have to move on at some point. And if they've established a good relationship with that community, and that community eyes and ears are working with the police department, and if the community values what those officers are doing, and if those officers value that community, they know each other, those officers can lead, and that resource, that intelligence, a good detective closes cases by having informants. Guess what? 800,000 residents in this community, they are your informants. And those informants are more inclined to work with you, given all the things that I've talked about. You connecting with them, you creating venues for them to be willing to work with you. So our success, our success is not determined by the 1,500, in my case, the 1,500 police officers, in your case, the 1,600 police officers alone. Our success, our being in the community, is really determined by the relationship that you have with that community and the willingness of that community to work with you.
Right. So you always talk about making deposits within the community. And then let's try to pull all this together as we close and have our next speaker. But can you talk a little bit about how that working with the community, working with your police officers, changing mentality, how will that work when you had the major Occupy Wall Street movement? I know you were doing a lot with the media, you were talking to the community, you were talking to the protesters, your officers were showing some great restraint. I mean, what can we learn? There's a lot of us here in law enforcement. We've not had a protest of that scale in Indianapolis. How did you handle that? How did you maneuver through it?
Yeah, I had an experience, and he's talking about, I think, Wall Street Denver, which is very aggressive, very focused on what their mission was. I had an experience, and I was talking to one of your young sergeants earlier, back in my days in Greensboro. In Greensboro, North Carolina, I was the chief there. And it was this group of individuals that had great disdain for policing. Great disdain for policing. And to be honest with you, I didn't have a lot of love for them either. So one day, it just hit me. I was just totally frustrated. I don't know if it hit me or if my wife hit me and told me I had to do something different. I called in the leader of that particular group. Took a lot of maylocks before I called that person in because I knew it was going to be not a pleasant conversation. And for maybe the first time in my career, I set aside our differences and I sit down and I listen to what the person was saying. Okay. And while I disagreed with about 90% of what that person was saying, what I got from that conversation was that person was very passionate and that person believed in what they stood for. Okay, and then as a result of doing that over the course of conversations, I had an opportunity to have an exchange from my perspective, the police perspective, of what we did and why we did it. And while that person disagreed with me probably 90% of the time, that person believed that I was passionate about what I was saying and what we did. And you know what came out of that? Respect. So one of the things that is absolutely critical dealing with entities, whether you agree or disagree with them, try to get to the point where you can respect each other. It has nothing to do about agreeing necessarily. It's about respecting each other. And I will tell you, if you can garner that respect between different groups and different individuals, you can find things of mutual agreement that you can progress in. So what happened in Denver, my first week here, against the suggestion of my entire command staff, I actually just went into the middle of one of these Wall Street demonstrations and sit down and actually had a conversation, told them I was new, and invited the leaders back to police headquarters where we sit down and had a conversation. We didn't agree on a whole lot, by the way, but the demonstrations from that point moving forward over a period of time and over a period of establishing those kind of respect for each other were a lot less damaging to the rest of the community that was impacted by them sitting in the street and blocking the traffic. And we were able to communicate with each other, so we were able to resolve some of the issues a lot more expeditiously. We didn't resolve all of them, but we had to understand. So, I mean, for me, life is about establishing relationships, not necessarily agreeing. Hey, I've been married for 36 years, and I will tell you that my wife and I disagree on some things. But the one thing that we have in common is we want the same outcome. So we have great respect for each other. I will also tell you, this is another aside. Every morning, for those of you who are in relationships or newly married, I'm gonna give you some free advice. Troy didn't ask this. When you wake up in the morning, the first thing you should do, this is for the men, is apologize. Going to my wife, I do a stupid decision every single day. So for 36 years, the first thing I do is apologize to her.
That's kind of hard to top there, Chief.
Especially since Kara sits right over
Yeah,
there.
no, we got to be careful. Let me talk about that. We got a few more minutes, just a couple more, but let's talk about that again. And this, I think, for the community, but specifically for those in command staff here. And I want to go back to Louisville again. So we're at 6th and Jefferson, where the headquarters is, and in the intersection of 6th and Jefferson is, I'm guessing, 200, 300 people protesting. Anarchists show up, start beating on different things, causing the crowd to get a little irritated and agitated. They broke a window out, happened to be in your office. We have issues that are developing, protests going on, and it was all over. An officer that was doing a controlled buy on the street corner, the suspect got into a fight with the officer, basically won the fight, ran from the officer. The officer shot and struck the individual in the back. The individual died. The suspect did. The suspect had a weapon on him, but it wasn't showing at the time. Protests ensued. That night, what happened with that, because I know I'll get questions, is I don't think that individual was charged criminally, but Chief White fired him, terminating him and his employment. But during that incident, what the protesters didn't know is I think we had 100 or 150 officers in full riot gear in the basement of the police headquarters. The public didn't know that. You wanted them out of sight because you thought they may inflame the tensions. They were there all day. They were hearing these protests. I know Chief Sohan from Louisville International Airport's here. I actually used his credit card to buy him pizza. I don't know if we ever paid him back. But you went out and spoke to the crowd against the advice of most of your staff. And I was with you, and you waded out into the crowd and had a conversation with the protest leader who was obviously didn't have control. For the police staff here, the command staff, why was that important for you to do that before you released 100 plus officers in full riot gear?
Part of leadership is taking responsibility. And my concern was not only just the individuals that were protesting, but actually the police officers. And it was obvious to me that while that scenario was somewhat out of control, but if we had released those officers in the riot gear, and again it goes back to Dr. Carter, it would have exacerbated the situation, and it probably would have been a full riot. So really, I thought it was an opportunity to actually listen to what their real issue was. And that started a relationship, by the way, with somebody who had great disdain for the police department in Louisville. And matter of fact, you might recall, as a result of that whole event, and after it had calmed down, I went to the west end of town, which is a challenging end of town for us in Louisville, and sat down with that whole coalition and listened to what their gripes were about that. Actually, they were demonstrating every single Sunday. Why they were having these regular demonstrations and what their expectations were, and explained to them. So that particular incident, I just thought things were really getting out of control. And to be honest with you, I didn't think that, to be honest, we didn't have anything to lose by doing that. And I thought it was my responsibility as a chief for the men and women of the department, but also for the community, to go out and have an exchange with those individuals that were creating that. To let them know that I cared enough, not just about those officers, but I cared enough about those individuals that were demonstrating, that I was going to go out there in the middle of that and have that conversation and see if, in fact, that we can subside some of the tensions that were occurring. It just so happened, as a result of that, a couple of hours later, things did cool down, and we continued on. Again, it goes back to what Dr. Carter said. We continued on with that relationship. You can't just have these one-time incidents and these one-time relationships and expect that is going to fix the issue, because it is not going to fix the issue. You've got to have an ongoing relationship with as many different parts of your community, those that support you and those that don't support you, and those that are on the fence to the extent possible. Because you're right. Your department, probably like most departments, you all are probably responding to 1 million calls a year, if I had to take a guess, just based on the population and the size of your department. And I will tell you, well, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, something controversial is going to happen. Guaranteed. Could happen today, could happen next month. Something controversial is going to happen. It depends on the relationship that you have with the community, particularly the community that is more likely to raise hell, which is probably 5% of the community that gets 95% of the time. Depends on that kind of relationship that you have. That will determine how quick your community heals over that process. So it goes back to making deposits. You've got to make as many deposits in this community as possible, because when that controversial thing happens, that's going to be a withdrawal. So you have to hope, and I know that you do that because I mentored to you, I trained you. Because when that controversial thing happens, you have to hope that you have made enough good deposits so the healing process will be that much quicker and it will be that less confrontational.
Yeah, just let me add, the decision to release the officers there to do what they were trained to do, we were very close. And because of the chief's willingness to lead and the community's willingness to listen, that city averted what could have really been probably the worst situation the city had seen since the busing riots in the 70s. So it shows how that community and leadership partnership, and you can have that conversation because you've talked to the individual before. I'm going to ask Captain Riddle to make his way forward to announce our next speaker. But Chief, Denver's lucky to have you as chief. You're a great chief. You're an even better friend.